When we look back on this conflict, there are two real huge military failures that just stand out that I think we'll study and wonder how did they make these decisions? And that's the 2023 summer offensive, and then this Kursk operation.
The 2023 offensive was launched with a great deal of fanfare and encouragement by the Western powers. The West was very heavily involved and was really pushing. I remember, like, there was talk of it. It was there was no surprise. Everybody knew it was going to happen. They even made something like a trailer about it. The Ukrainians did ahead of time. But there was like, oh yeah, we're going to have this great offensive, and we're going to drive all the way to the Sea of Azov, and it's going to lead to a total collapse of the Russian army. They're going to flee in panic, and then we're going to march on to Crimea. And you got a lot of this big talk, not just from the Ukrainians, but a lot of Western military leaders as well. These units were, there was months and months of preparation. The Ukrainian units were trained in the West. They were supplied with, with the Leopard tanks and the Challenger tanks, and there was all talk about again how each of the Russians wouldn't be able to, when they saw one of these tanks coming over the hill or whatever, or coming across the field, they would just turn and flee. Everybody was told that Russian morale was very, very low. And well, in the meantime, actually, in the months leading up to it, I think it was starting in the fall of 2022, the Russians actually worked on building at least 3 lines of fortifications. I believe in some areas they had up to 6 lines. They were very extensive, very formidable lines of defense. So they were waiting for it. They knew it was coming, and they were completely ready. And it was in June of 2023 that the Ukrainians launched this offensive, and it was, I remember the videos and the images for the first several days, where you just see what the Russians had done is that, like, ahead of that first line of fortifications, they had actually laid out very extensive and dense minefields. And then they also, they had small units occupy certain, small fortifications, really firing points. And this is what it was called by different names, like the crumple zone or security zone or whatever. It's just this area north of that first line of fortifications. And for the truth be told, is the Ukrainians never got past that. They never even got to that first line of fortifications. There may have been one. In fact, I think there was one video of like one armored vehicle actually reaching, kind of rolling. I think it may have been disabled and just rolled up and kind of touched that first line of fortifications in or close to the little village of Rabitana, which was fought over for a long, long time. They just got stuck in that security zone, and they just suffered, terrible losses. There were the minefields were very, very effective, and they had a terrible time getting through them. And then they fought some very intensive battles. Probably the most famous of it was over a very, very small village, Rabitana, which was again in front of that first line of fortifications. And that's as far as they got. And then eventually, like when it was all over, several months ago, the Russians took back all of these places, they were very, very minor gains and at extremely high costs. So yeah, it was a total disaster. What it did is it just greatly weakened. At that time, the Ukrainian army was rather formidable. They had a lot of reserves. They had a lot of equipment. And the Russians, at that time, starting in the fall of 2022, began building up their forces because they realized, oh, this is a real war. Before it was this limited operation that hopefully was going to lead to some sort of peace agreement. But now this is a real war. They mobilized. They began, accepting volunteers. They began building up their forces. And while they're doing this, they said, okay, yeah, there wasn't really any effort, I think with maybe one minor exception around Kupiansk in the north. There weren't really any offensive operations to speak of. They just held the line. They just waited for the Ukrainians to attack, and the Ukrainians obliged. They just they smashed against this wall. Actually, they didn't even get to the wall, but they expended a large number of men and equipment, a large amount of equipment there in front of that first wall. And so when it was all over, in the fall of 2023, then the Russians began to go on the offensive. They began to move at Avdiivka in particular. And that was a crucial battle. Again, I think that was the fortress city very close to Donetsk, to the city. And when they took it in February of the following year. That really changed everything. The whole front began to unravel, and we're seeing the consequences now. So that's what happened with that offensive. Now, at least after the summer 2023 offensive, they did have defensive fortifications like the Ukrainians did that they could fall back to. But in the Sumy region, as you pointed out, they really don't. So this was just idiotic. Again, I think we see Zelensky's fingerprints on it. The comedian, this guy is not a military man by any stretch of the imagination. So, not only did this operation never make sense, but clearly they didn't stop and think, well, what if we have to retreat? No preparations were made, and now they're in a terrible fix. So, the Russians are chasing them across the border, and it's pretty much, open all the way to Sumy. To the city of Sumy.
It seems very clear that after the summer 2023 offensive, that any possibility of Ukraine retaking the territories that Russia was currently holding is impossible.
Yeah.
That's where it should have ended. But obviously here we are now with how many more people have died. And it was clear that it's not an obtainable objective. And it's also, I think, a real point of contention with negotiations to be able to say that Russia's going to hold on to these territories. When we all know that that's the case. This was a done deal. It was a done deal from the beginning, really. Mm-hmm. And then after the summer 2023 offensive, people that may have been naive enough to believe that, oh, yeah, they watched that trailer the Ukrainians made, and look at them, they're going all the way to Sea of Azov, they'll take Crimea, and who knows, they might just go straight to Moscow. Like you said, they didn't even reach the first line of defenses. That's when it should have ended. That's when it should have been clear to everybody. But why does it keep going? And we're still in the situation where you have forced conscription. Just the horror of this war, we don't know how many men have died on the Ukrainian side. 1 million that I hear of that are severely wounded or killed. It's just so awful, and we just keep it going, sending them into the meat grinder. It's unconscionable. It has to end. And I thought that Trump would be the person that would be. He voiced some sentiment saying I just want the killing to stop. I want people to die. I don't want people to die. Right? It's how is it that we as human beings that are involved in this conflict just can't come to terms with that these are real lives that we're playing with, that these are just every day more and more young men are dying. More and more young men that are the future of Ukraine, that are going to have children that deserve to have fulfilling, fruitful lives, and they're just being extinguished every day. It's just I know it's frustrating that it just keeps on going. Why can't is there no humanity left in these leaders? I don't understand. Yeah. Why can't we? It's clear that it's over. It's clear that Ukraine can't take back these territories. Ukraine can't win. Your only solution is potentially triggering World War III, where maybe 100 million people are going to kill, or the end of the world. That's clearly not an okay option, right? Why are we playing this game? What's driving it?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, I think maybe you have to point to two main culprits, and one is the Kiev regime itself. It is an ultra-nationalist kind of nihilistic, Russian-hating regime. And the people that have taken power, they're not the people, they don't represent the majority of Ukrainians, who I think are like people everywhere. But the people who have taken power in this country, they've grown in power like ever since independence in 1991. But they really seized power, became a part of the government, and began to extend their control over the government with the Maidan coup in 2014. These people are in the grips of an ideological vision, that just does not admit of any compromise, and seems to regard death as well, again, as more glorious than life, especially so that they they are willing to sacrifice their countrymen for this cause, and many of them are willing to die for it themselves. They to in this effort to realize their really evil vision. Their hatred is so intense, again, that they would rather that they just all, that they would rather have utter destruction and mass death than actually bend the knee to Russia and to admit that Russia was the victor. We just see that in everything, the statements of Zelensky and other leaders of the country, and then of these, of the various ultranationalists. I mean, again, I think all these, Zelensky himself, he originally wasn't an ultranationalist, but he has become one. It is just that's the power that dominates now. I think we get a sense of what that power is like in the person of somebody who was assassinated actually just this morning in Odessa. His name was, I think, Ganol. And was just reading a little bit of, a biography of his. Not exactly a biography, but just a description of his activities over the last few years. He was one of the leaders of the Odessa massacre back in 2014. And that's when, there were some people after the Maidan coup. There were people in other parts of the country, in Odessa and, clearly in the Donbass, who protested. And, Donbass had led to an actual, secession and the beginnings of the Civil War. They, after when, okay, well, we'll at least set the Donbass aside. That's another history. Let's just talk about Odessa here. There were protests that were held in central Odessa against the Maidan coup. And this, the protesters were attacked by the ultranationalists, and the protesters fled into a trade union building right there in the center of Odessa. And then what the ultranationalists did is they set fire to it, and they stood outside laughing and jeering as they watched these people burn alive. The official count is 47. Others say that it might have been much higher, that 47 died in that fire. They're all innocents. Nobody's claiming otherwise. Even the European, Human Rights Commission or court just recently judged that the Ukrainian government was liable, needed to pay compensation to all the victims. Now, the very disturbing thing about this is that this event, there was never a proper investigation. Nobody was ever brought to account. Nobody was ever, arrested or detained. The organizers, the leaders, just continued to, in their activities, and that tells you something about this regime, right? One of those leaders again was Ganul, and he went on to, continue to persecute Russian speakers. He's been involved in vandalizing and destroying all kinds of Soviet and other Russia-linked monuments. He's been involved in the persecution of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, and he also works with the TCC. These are the press gang guys. He beats up people who resist, and there's actually there's a picture out there where he beat up somebody who was in a gym and had been seized and was trying to resist being forcibly sent to the front. And you see the guy, with bloody face, and here's Ganul just grinning in front of him. And you hear later, according to local reports, that this poor man was sodomized, while in detention prior to being sent to the front. Well, this guy was assassinated, Ganul. You can imagine the rage of many Odessans. The thing to say is, like, this tells you what kind of country you have, because somebody like that in a normal country would have been arrested a long time ago, but he's free to terrorize the population because he's actually working for the government. Maybe not officially, but he's actually enforcing, the preferences, the will of the government. That's the kind of government you have there, and that's part of the reason that we see this insistence on war, war to the bitter end, a war that clearly will destroy Ukraine. That's the kind of people. They live by a code of violence. But then we have the European leaders, and before that, the Biden administration, who, it's hard to explain them. We've tried to talk about them many times, but it's a combination of delusion, but also I think a real lack of empathy again, you recently just pointed out that Trump has said, hey, too many people are getting killed. This is terrible. And he's right. And when he said that, I was struck by the fact that I never heard anything like that from Biden or really from any other Western leader. It's just like I don't think the thought really crossed their mind. They just live in this world of fantasy. It's kind of a cartoon world in which, again, they're the good people. So they just suppress all information that might conflict with that vain assumption. And they pursue these policies that have very, very destructive consequences. But they seem to be incapable of reflection and of real human empathy. Again, we mentioned what's going on in Syria and, of course, and in Gaza. Again, there's just been this total lack of empathy or concern for the consequences of their policies. It's just that, in the end, they're so wedded to the notion that that they are the exceptional people that should be leading the world. They are the garden, the rest of the world is the jungle, to again quote Joseph Borrell, the former foreign minister of the EU. I think they're just so wrapped up in their own delusion that, again, they clearly just don't really have much of a grip of reality. We've talked earlier about maybe how this happened, and I think it's a product, I think, in good part, not entirely, but in good part of the unipolar moment. And they, eventually, they became they adopted the vision that the U.S. had, the exceptionalist vision, and they can't let go. They've actually become, more fervent believers in it than, certainly than the current U.S. administration is. So it's this Western exceptionalism plus this very, very ugly, violent Banderite ideology in Ukraine that accounts for what we're seeing.